To this evidence session of the Home Affairs Select Committee. We're taking evidence this morning from the Home Secretary and the Permanent Secretary. Welcome to our witnesses. We also have Paul Lincoln from the Border Force with us this morning. Welcome to our witnesses. We're very grateful for your time this morning. Can I begin with a quick first question around the COVID border arrangements? Obviously, the Delta variant is now responsible for the highest COVID rates that we've ever seen, and it is clear that from the scientists' evidence that there were multiple introductions of the virus over several weeks that helped it spread so fast. So the system that you have in place to prevent new variants spreading clearly didn't operate quickly enough to prevent that happening. Why is that?
Well, Chair, good morning. Why don't I come in and just outline the system that we do have in terms of checks?
I think we probably don't have time to go into the factual things that everybody knows. What I'm keen to understand is, given that this system clearly failed, why did it? And therefore, what will we need to do to prevent future new variants?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to say the system has not failed. This is a comprehensive system across the whole of government. This isn't just Border Force and the Home Office. This is a system that has been put in place across government, working with the Department of Transport in particular, but also working with the JBC, who I understand have given evidence in private to the committee recently. And the fact of the matter is we do have an end-to-end comprehensive approach when it comes to border security, but importantly, health measures at the border, and that is through the 100% compliance, the checks that we have in place, and of course, as the country will be very well aware, with the red, amber, green traffic light system that is put in place. But I'm very happy to ask Paul to come on in to speak about the measures and how we are absolutely making sure, through the sequencing, genomic sequencing that has taken place, we're able to spot variants of concern, and in addition to that, actually deal with them when it comes to the MQS process and through the red listing of countries, how that is managed across government.
But it clearly did fail, because we've got more cases in many areas of the country. We've got more cases of the Delta variant than we've ever had of any COVID variant at all. So it clearly failed. Now, there may be specific reasons, but it clearly failed. How can you possibly say that it didn't fail to stop the new variant spreading right across the country?
Well, what I'm saying, Chair, is that we have a comprehensive end-to-end system when it comes to managing health measures at the border, and the government has had a long-standing record and policy of managing health measures at the border, which is very, very well publicised and well aware. And on top of that, of course, we have the largest genomic sequencing capacity in the world, effectively, which has been able to spot these variants of concerns that have been coming into the country. And that has also helped to structure the way in which governments across the whole of government, I should emphasise, based on JBC, based on work with the Department of Health, based on work with the Department of Transport, then that measures are then operationalised at the border through Border Force, but also upstreamed in terms of checks that carriers are undertaking.
But it clearly hasn't worked. And the reason this matters is because, given that it hasn't worked, we need to have confidence in what you're doing for the future, whether you're going to react quickly enough to any other new variants that might somehow threaten the vaccine programme. And if you won't even recognise that the system did fail on Delta, it's very hard to have confidence in it. Just one final question on this. NervTag said on the 16th of April that it was worried about India and that travel advice needed to be reviewed. You'd already seen a big soaring of cases, doubling every week in early April in India, and concerns being raised about potential new variants. Given that NervTag said that on the 16th of April, why did it take a full week until the 23rd of April for India to be put on the red list?
Well, first of all, Chair, it is entirely wrong to suggest, that we delayed putting India on the red list, which is effectively the suggestion that's being made. There were other countries that were put on the red list, including Bangladesh and Pakistan, early in April, and that decision was taken on the basis of the positivity rate of people entering the country and the data that showed the proportion of people testing positive. So this does come back to effective measures where we were able to test people who were coming into the country was 3 times higher amongst people coming in from Pakistan than India. And of course, the date of the India red listing, the ban, was the 23rd of April, with everyone arriving from India then being put into quarantine in a hotel for 10 days. And that is also 5 days before the Delta variant was formally put under investigation on the 28th of April, and 2 weeks before it is labelled a variant of concern on the 7th of May. And even before India was red listed, everyone had to quarantine from red listed countries on arrival for 10 days, and also take a pre-departure test, take further tests on day 2, day 8, and that was in addition to the upstreaming of checks through carriers, and carriers were explicitly, there's a fine involved for carriers, which Transport have put in place, effectively, basically for carriers to help us and support with that 100% compliance checks that were undertaken. And it is important to recognise that it is the testing capability and the sequencing that has been able to identify variants of concern, and that is fundamental to government policy and will continue to be, as colleagues Matthew and Paul testify. And I would suggest, Chair, other colleagues across government would testify. You've spoken to JVC, if you speak to the Department of Health and the capacity there, and Public Health England, these are all important component parts that come together to demonstrate the
another
approach that is taking place when it comes to the end-to-end border policy.
Unfortunately, Home Secretary, I don't think there's anybody in the country who thinks that your border policy worked to prevent the Delta variant spreading right across the country, and we can see the evidence. And so it's therefore quite troubling that you're effectively saying the policy did work and isn't being changed in order to react more swiftly. But we need to move on. Stuart MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. If I could start just with one quick question about the EU settlement scheme, and I don't want to reopen a debate about how that scheme should have been designed or whatever else. It's specifically about an elderly person who has missed the deadline and needs medical treatment, and because they haven't applied in time, they're then charged, levied a charge for the treatment that they get. If that person goes on and applies late and the Home Office accepts that they had a reasonable excuse for that late application, that's well and good in terms of the status. But the problem, as I understand it, is that they would still have to pay that bill for their NHS treatment. When I asked the Minister about this when he was here at the committee last autumn, he said he would have found that outcome bizarre and it wouldn't have made sense, essentially. Is that an accident that has ended up being the guidance? Why is that the case?
Well, I think, first of all, if I can just speak about the EU settlement scheme, applicants have had 27 months to submit their application. And I think one of the important points, there are several important points to make about the scheme itself, because it is a success, and the way the scheme has been designed, and the fact that more than 6 million applications have been received and more than 5.4 million have been included, demonstrates the effectiveness of the scheme. Now, of course, I will absolutely recognise that where there are specific cases, we will look at the circumstances around cases, and we have demonstrated great flexibility around all cases in the EU SS scheme. And not only that, when we look at the length of the scheme, how long it's been open for, the ways of working...
You're not answering the question. I don't want to reopen the whole debate about the EU settlement scheme. I simply want to know why it is that somebody who has a reasonable excuse for a late application would still have to pay thousands of pounds in NHS charges, despite the fact they did have a reasonable excuse. Perhaps this lady or gentleman has early onset dementia, for example. They didn't realise they had to apply. Surely that's something that Home Office will look again. That's all I'm asking.
Well, first of all, the Department of Health and Social Care has made it clear that where a late application to the scheme has been made, the individual will not be charged for NHS healthcare from the date of that application until the outcome is final. And this includes the outcome of any appeal and decision to refuse an application.
Yeah, no, that's good, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. But the point is that there will be people who will only realise they haven't applied when they go and seek treatment, and they will incur those charges anyway. For the NHS or the Department for Health and for the Home Office, you're talking tiny sums of money. But for these people, many thousands of pounds could be absolutely devastating for them. It's a tiny tweak. All I'm asking is that the Home Office and the Department for Health just think again about that.
Well, I think it's important to reflect, if I can just repeat what I've said, in terms of where there has been a late application, the individual will not be charged for NHS healthcare. And it is important to recognise that...
But they will if they incurred that charge before making the application. It's a tiny tweak that could make a huge difference to people. Otherwise, you're repeating the Windrush situation again.
I think it's wrong to conflate Windrush, actually, the scandal of Windrush, with this particular example that you are using. And I think that's very unfair. And it's also very unfair to the case...
Exactly what happened to Albert Thompson. Okay, if you're not willing to look at that again, a simple measure that would cost nothing to your department but would be absolutely disastrous for individuals.
Well,
just not even think about it.
Well, if you'd like to hear me answer the question rather than speaking over to me, it is also, when you're basically suggesting that I'm not prepared to look at this. The fact of the matter is that any claimant will be backdated if there is any example in the way in which you have outlined already. And it is perfectly true, as we all know, that when it comes to GP services, primary care, these aspects are all free of charge in the NHS, and rightly so. So if there is any example where someone has been charged, and obviously when that application comes in, then that individual will be supported and anything else will be backdated. So there are ways and there are processes in government where this is joined up across the NHS and across the Home Office. And as I've said, this is about how we actually treat individual applicants. And it's right that we spend the time to look at it.
I'll follow up and write on the detail, but it sounds like there's a possibility of it. Well, you're trying to talk out time. It's quite obvious. I mean, if you're happy to look at it again, that's great. Can I ask you about Napier Barracks now? Was obviously the interim report by the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, and at the time nobody made a statement in Parliament about it because it was an interim report. Is it correct that the final report has been with you since May?
Well, I think first of all, if I may, just in response to your last comment, it's not a case about talking out time at all. I think that's very unfair. You asked me to answer the question, that's effectively what I've been doing. And in terms of Napier, I would just like to start by actually saying again that in terms of we have taken all the appropriate measures and steps. And in terms of the report itself, the report will be published in due course, which is part of all the process.
Is it going to be published on Thursday by any chance? Am I correct in understanding it's been published on Thursday, despite having been with you since May?
Well, there is a date for publication.
Thursday, the last day of term.
Publication. Well, before Parliament rises, so there is a date for publication.
And you expect us to be grateful for that? I mean, this is classic Home Office, an absolutely scathing report that you've had since May, and you're going to punt it out on the last day of term with it. Are you going to make a statement about it or answer questions in the House?
If I may, I think that's incredibly unfair because I think it's important to reflect and recognise that the Home Office absolutely takes all these reports seriously. It's right that we have time to go through them in the same way in terms of court judgments and findings that are also published or reports that come to us. And I think it's an absolute disservice, particularly to Home Office officials who do a great deal of work to follow advice, look at reports that come through, and to absolutely make sure that we are looking at all the details and that we learn lessons as well. And I think the other point to make, if I may, in terms of the report itself, the Home Office has only received the interim report.
It received the final report in the full inspection.
That's incorrect. We have received an interim report and not a final report.
So the Chief Inspector of Prisons for England and Wales only says the full inspection report was sent to the Home Secretary in May. He's wrong about that, or have you just not seen it?
We have received an interim report. I don't know if Matthew wants to come in on this at all, because Matthew will know the sequencing of the reports.
Just to say, thank you, thank you, Chair, thank you, Mr. McDonald. Just to say that the Home Office is working to continually improve our transparency. That's an important part of the Windrush lessons learned, a really important recommendation that Windy really had for us.
And do you have the final report from the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration? The Prisons Inspector says it was sent to you in May. Can you confirm that, Mr. Rycroft?
I think there are two separate reports, one from the Independent Commissioner on Immigration and Borders and another from the Inspector of Prisons. And we will make sure that whatever needs to be published is published.
No, but I'm reading from the annual report of the Chief Inspector from yesterday. The Chief Inspector of Prisons yesterday says the IGB published a summary of the findings in March this year, and the full inspection report was sent to the Home Secretary in May. Is he wrong?
We've had the full report from him, from the Inspector of Prisons. We have not yet had the full report from the ICIBI.
So have you published the full report from the Inspector of Prisons?
I think that is what will be published before the end of this parliamentary term.
Oh, so that one will be published on Thursday. Too late for us to be able to ask you questions about it?
It will be published before the end of this parliamentary session.
It's not right, it'll be published. Okay. There is something really Kafkaesque, Permanent Secretary, about you saying you will publish whatever needs to be published. It's our role to scrutinise, and we therefore want to see the reports that you've had for many months. Home Secretary, why has the report from the Inspector of Prisons not already been published?
Well, we will actually check as to when that report came into the department. We'll check and come back to you actually during these proceedings. But obviously there is some conflation between the two reports in terms of what's been received and what hasn't.
Okay, Diana Johnson.
Thank you very much. I would just like to carry on discussing Napier Barracks, but also just public health guidance on dormitory accommodation. And I want to, Home Secretary, refer you back to the 24th of February 2021, when you told the committee that Napier and Penally had been adapted in line with and in light of public health guidance. You told us that it is all working in line with public health guidance and with local authority partners throughout all this, so we have been following guidance in every single way. I think the problem is, Home Secretary, is that since that day we found out that the ICIBI's report that both sites were opened before Public Health Wales and Public Health England's recommendations had been actioned. A report by the Local Health Board that in mid-November 2020 they still had not received assurances from the Home Office that the guidance and advice they offered to aid COVID-19 security had been acted upon. We know there's a letter from Public Health Wales that in September 2020 there had been no plans by the Home Office to implement COVID-19 risk pathways on site, to segregate dormitories into COVID-19 bubbles, or to segregate parts of Penally Camp for COVID-19 reduction, and a letter from Kent Resilience Forum that they had been clear with the Home Office that accommodation for asylum seekers should consist of single-room accommodation with ensuite facilities, as recommended by Public Health England guidance, and that it was difficult to envisage that Napier Barracks could be considered COVID safe given the proposed numbers of service users at the site. So in light of this, why did you tell us that you were following guidance in every single way? Were you aware of these pieces of advice when you last appeared before us at this committee?
Well, thank you for your question. And I think there's some important points to make about Napier Barracks. First of all, the department, based on the information that was provided to myself and to ministers, we have always believed that we were taking reasonable steps to give effect to advice. And that specifically applies to the steps that should be taken, of course, when it came to making dormitory accommodation as safe as possible. And we've always, throughout the pandemic, we have worked closely with health bodies, taken regard of advice and guidance that has come to us. And that, of course, is both in dialogue that takes place with officials of Public Health England and also in written advice as well. But I do think it is really important, and it's worth just reminding everybody that the situation that was faced with regards to accommodation.
Can I just stop you there before you go on to that? Because I just read out to you quite a long, lengthy list of the evidence that we have now been sent and know about, that what you told us in February does not match. So are you saying on reflection that what you told us in February was correct, or are you saying that you weren't given the information, you weren't given the advice, you didn't know about that?
No, I absolutely believe that we were, in terms of what I said at committee, that was based absolutely on the information that was given to me at the time.
So your officials didn't give you the information, is that what you're saying?
We believe that we were taking reasonable steps, as I've said, to give effect to advice, Public Health England advice. And post the various reports, and Matthew will expand upon this as well, and the court findings and the interim reports, of course, there's been a lot of work that's been undertaken since. And even with regards to the court finding as well, that was a reflection of a particular time in terms of the situation on the ground on Napier. There have been improvements throughout the establishment of Napier, and I think that's important to recognise.
I think what's worrying me as a Member of Parliament is that as a Minister, you seem to be saying that you weren't given the information when you were making decisions about Napier and Penally. So is that correct? You're saying that you didn't know that all these bodies and organisations were raising concerns. You weren't told that.
Well, I have, as the Permanent Secretary, and I explained in February, I think it's important to recognise, of course, there's a difference between, well, when it comes to public health bodies, they don't certify standards, but they gave us advice on standards to which we were operating. And officials worked with that advice. And on that basis, they went on to make the best decisions at the time.
But you took the decisions, didn't you?
And clearly, it's decisions taken across the department with officials, with practitioners, because obviously this is operational decisions made in conjunction with accommodation providers.
And do you just to kind of reflect on that then? Are you happy that that was the situation that you were put in terms of not being given all this information and advice and guidance that was being put to the Home Office? Do you feel that's...
No, well, look, I think we absolutely have to reflect upon the situation that we were facing when we established Napier, but also the evolving situation around the pandemic and changes in guidance. Guidance in September was very different to guidance in December. Guidance has constantly changed, and operationalising that is very difficult, and there's been a great deal of work across the Home Office, and Matthew will happily expand upon that post the interim report, but also the court findings in the ways of working, and also how we have made adjustments to arrangements, basically in what has been a very, very challenging operating environment. I think we have to reflect, although we've been in a pandemic, the pandemic has not stopped illegal migration. It has not stopped the need to house people. We have a statutory duty to house people.
Okay, well, I think I hear, I don't think I'm going to get any further on this, but obviously you have a duty to house people in a safe way, and when all the advice is that this is not safe to put people into dormitory accommodation, I am rather flummoxed as to why in September you were deciding to do that. But I just want to ask you now, because I know time is pressing, about people who are accommodated in Napier Barracks now. So how many people are currently sharing a dormitory? How many of them are unvaccinated? And what is your assessment of the likelihood of a significant COVID outbreak?
Well, I think, first of all, if I can bring Matthew on the numbers, what I can tell you is that there are 14 accommodation blocks that are in use at Napier now, which can accommodate, and Matthew will correct me if I'm wrong on this, between 24 and 26 people. We have dropped the capacity of the site, and that is absolutely to make sure that there's COVID measures, COVID compliance, and also flexibility. This pandemic is moving. We have to have the ability to adjust our accommodation sites in light of what we're seeing with the pandemic. And I think the other point you've just asked about vaccines. We make it an absolute priority to offer everyone across the asylum estate vaccines, and everyone at Napier has been offered the vaccine. Matthew might want to come in on.
Thank you. Just to add then, so the numbers are, so the total maximum capacity has been reduced to 308. The total number actually in Napier today stands at 103. Within that 103, some people are in single and double rooms, and a total of 59 are in the dormitory accommodation. It's worth saying that at no stage did PHE say that it is not acceptable to use dormitories. In fact, they very explicitly gave us advice on how to make dormitory style accommodation as safe as possible, and it's that we were following that the Home Secretary referred to.
Just finally, I want to ask you a question about local authorities that have come forward to house asylum seekers. As you say, Home Secretary, there have been concerns over the last, during the period of the pandemic, about being able to house people who are claiming asylum. I just want to ask you, Home Secretary, do you think it is appropriate that local authorities which come forward and offer to work with you and accommodate asylum seekers are then unilaterally told that numbers will increase with no consultation, with no regard to issues that of the local community cohesion, etc. Whereas other local authorities never take asylum seekers, do not engage with the Home Office, and are allowed to get away with that. Whereas those that do engage are treated in this very high-handed and arrogant way. What's your feeling about that, Home Secretary?
Well, I'm actually very clear on this. I think that's thoroughly unacceptable.
Well, why are your ministers doing it?
Well, actually, there is a lot of change underway in this department right now, and that equally applies to how officials and how the department engages with local authorities. Now, Matthew may want to come in on this, but there is a great deal of work taking place, and I do actually just want to give the committee some assurance and some insight on this. And I think, committee members are always very welcome to come in and bring their own experiences into the department for officials to hear about local authority engagement. I myself speak to, as do ministers, colleagues constantly. The number one principle should be that all local authorities should be engaged in an equal and fair and open, transparent way. There are many outstanding local authorities across the country that, quite frankly, do incredible work in supporting not just the Home Office, but actually the country and our statutory national duties around housing asylum seekers. Nobody takes that responsibility lightly at all. It's a very serious responsibility. But I think also we must reflect and put this within the context of there are pressures. Every member of Parliament and across local authorities as well, everyone recognises there are pressures on housing stock. So when it comes to dispersed accommodation, we struggle to find dispersed accommodation. When it comes to the pandemic, and it's even harder throughout the pandemic as well, when it comes to the pandemic, we all know that last April, and it's not just in the Home Office, but also MHCLG and across MOJ as well, major changes had to be made in terms of housing people we have a national statutory responsibility for. In our case, asylum seekers, but also looking at new accommodation. In our case, it meant dispersed accommodation, new types of dispersed accommodation. We use hotels. We've had to use hotels. We've had to work with local authorities and MPs on.
We need to keep moving.
But also when it comes to even the point about Napier, we've had to look at different ways to accommodate people.
Apologies for interrupting, Home Secretary. Sorry,
and that will continue. I think, if I may,
I will write to you. I will write to you with my concerns because they are specific. Yeah.
Thank you. And I would ask all members of the committee to, and I ask members of Parliament as well.
That's fine, Home Secretary. We need to just clarify. Home Secretary, I need to just clarify some of the responses you've just given to Diana Johnson. Your officials on the 7th of September said PHE advice is that dormitories are not suitable. PHE also told your officials in September, quote, I don't know how dormitories can be COVID compliant. Are you saying that you did not know about that PHE advice?
Well, I'm saying that through the advice that came to me, we as a department were absolutely believed that we were taking...
Did you know? But this is really important that we don't have any misinformation about this. Did you know that PHE were saying, I don't know how dormitories can be compliant, and were advising that dormitories are not suitable? Did you, as the Home Secretary responsible for the key decisions on this issue, did you know about that advice, yes or no?
Well, look, I think we do have to step back and look at the range of
advice. I think we need an answer about the answers that you've given us. The answers that you have given to Diana Johnson implied that you did not know what the PHE advice was. That is really serious because you need to be given the best, proper and full advice. So can you confirm, did you know about that PHE advice, yes or no?
Well, the advice that was given was based on PHE. I mean, I'll come back to the point. PHE, public health bodies, do not certify standards. They give advice on the standards to which we had to operate. And it is on that basis that decisions were taken and officials...
I've got the copies of the advice here. It says, PHE advice is that dormitories are not suitable. That is from an email from your officials on the 7th of September. There's also a further document that was sent to your officials in which PHE say, I don't know how dormitories can be COVID compliant. The court that looked at all of these details concluded the bottom line is that the arrangements at the barracks were contrary to the advice of PHE. So all of this is clear, it's copper bottom. The question is whether or not you knew about it, yes or no?
Well, I can't. Well, obviously, I did not see emails that went to officials, and I can only make decisions based on the advice that comes to me. And that advice, clearly, this is a difference between certifying standards, but the advice that came to me was based on the guidelines or the approach that we should be taking in terms of stepping up our facilities, making changes, and the steps that should be taken to make dormitory accommodation as safe as possible.
Okay, so question to Matthew Rycroft. Why did the Home Secretary not get shown this advice?
Chair, Public Health England did make clear during discussions early on in the process for acquiring Penally and Napier that the best way to minimise risk was to provide single rooms with ensuite facilities, but they also accepted that that is not always possible. And they were very explicit that there were ways of making other types of accommodation, including dormitories, as safe as possible. And that is the advice on which we were taking reasonable steps to act. And that advice was confirmed later on in their guidance for providers of accommodation for asylum seekers, which was back in December of last year. So it was a moving picture with different types of advice at different stages, and the advice that we were acting on was the formal one from December 2020.
Okay, so was the Home Secretary given the advice from September that dormitories were not suitable? Yes or no?
She's already answered the question about seeing individual emails from PHE to members.
But was she told explicitly that PHE said dormitories are not suitable? Yes or no? We need to know whether you are giving the Home Secretary proper advice.
We are giving the Home Secretary proper advice.
Did you give her that particular advice, that PHE advises that dormitories are not suitable? Did you tell her that?
I
yes
did not
or
tell
no?
her that. She did not see that email, as she has just said. But the advice.
But was she told that this is what PHE said?
I can't recall that. I'm seeking to focus on the big issue here, which is that.
The big issue is you had an outbreak of 200 cases in dormitory accommodation, and anybody across the country could tell you that putting people into dormitories in the middle of a pandemic was going to be a risk. That is the big picture. So I just want to know whether you showed the Home Secretary the guidance and the advice from PHE, yes or no?
That outbreak was in February of 2021. A full 2 months before that, the PHE advice was not the advice that you have been reading out, Chair. It was confirming that it was possible to make other types of accommodation that were not single rooms as COVID safe as possible. And that is the advice that was put to the Home Secretary.
The courts have made clear that not only did you fail to follow the PHE's clear recommendation that dormitories are not suitable, you also failed to implement their mitigation, their risk mitigation advice. So the precautions that were taken were completely inadequate to prevent the spread of COVID infection. Home Secretary, you told us that you were working in line with public health guidance and with local authority partners throughout. We've been following guidance in every single way. In the light of the advice that I've just told you about, that it's not clear that you actually saw, do you now admit that what you told us was not true?
No, I don't. On the basis that I came to committee and presented information based on the reasonable steps, the information that came to me, and also some of the work there has been work that has been undertaken with local authorities. And it's wrong to say, it is absolutely wrong to say that we ignore advice, that we're not working with third parties. We have to remember, I think it's so important just to remember the level of changing guidance, the level of changing rates of COVID, different aspects that were taking place around the pandemic. And I think, if I may, there'll also be be a public inquiry around COVID at some stage. And these will be momentary aspects that we must all reflect upon, because government has to make a range of decisions based on information that comes to us. As Matthew has said, as I've reflected upon as well, guidance has changed in incredible ways, actually, sometimes in a very fast way. And all stakeholders and all partners and all operational partners have to adjust accordingly. So we've always acted in good faith, and I think that's really important to emphasise that. We have acted in good faith to also put in place all sorts of measures around safeguarding, COVID compliance, but also all sorts of welfare facilities to adjust and adapt our size in the way in which all sorts of advice and recommendations has come from third parties.
Now, just clarify, Jen, just final factual point on this. So you still have people in dormitories of up to 14 people within a dormitory, up to 28 people within a block. Is that correct?
There are. We have made a huge number of improvements since the outbreak, including.
I'm just interested in the dormitory, the bed situation.
I've already answered that question, Chair, but just to repeat, there are 103 people in Napier today, of whom 59 are in dormitories, and we have made sure that there are distances between beds, that we have only 60 to 90 days total length of time for any individual. Okay. In Napier, we have a strict...
You had distance between beds last time. Are you still having 12 to 14 people in a room, in sleeping accommodation?
Well, that's the maximum that it is possible to fit in a room in a way that is as safe as possible.
But you're continuing as safe as possible.
Number to 59.
Okay. Last time you had an outbreak of 200 cases. We now have the Delta variant circulating, which is even more infectious. How long do you think it will be before you have another outbreak in your dormitory accommodation?
But in addition to the other changes that I've already described, we have also increased and strengthened the cleaning regime. We have improved the ventilation. We've improved the signage. We have ensured that if there is any vulnerability in relation to any individual in Napier, then they are moved to alternative accommodation. Okay, so all of those changes have happened since the previous outbreak, and we are continuing to follow the advice on how to make that sort of accommodation as COVID safe as possible.
You guys just don't learn lessons, do you? The court has already come to a really damning conclusion about your arrangements, as a result of which there may be significant compensation liabilities on the taxpayer, and you seem to be continuing to run up even more of them. It's just astonishing. It's irresponsible to people who are being put in COVID unsafe situations, and it's irresponsible for the taxpayer as well. Moving on to Andrew Gwynn.
Can I just come in on this? Because I just don't accept that. I mean, the Home Office, and bear in mind there is an asylum crisis right now with the highest level of migrants coming to the UK in a considerable period of time. Matthew has already outlined, first of all, when it came to the court judgment, that was a judgment for a particular moment in time when guidance has been shifted. And we've been very clear about that. We're in a pandemic. It is wrong to say that we are not learning lessons. Matthew and I have outlined pretty clearly, actually, the changes, remediations, the enhancements that have taken place. Changes to accommodation, changes to welfare, changes to provision. Let's not forget as well the vaccinations that have been put in place as well, and giving vaccinations to individuals to make sure that they are secure. And I think it's an easy option to try and decry our accommodation facilities, but I think at the same time, I've also just been asked by Dana Johnson about working with local authorities around asylum accommodation and authorities that are not working with us to house asylum seekers. We are absolutely doing our utmost to fulfil our statutory duties and responsibilities and obligations as a government to house people in the right way, which we are doing, and in a safe way. And I do think, with regards to the court judgment, it is wrong to say that we are not learning lessons. And the other point to make about the judgment is that the judgment was there it was reflecting, didn't even put in or reflect upon the improvements that had been made, a range of improvements that are constantly being made by all teams that are working incredibly hard in the Home Office on a very, very challenging situation.
We need to move on, but you have just said that this is the highest number of people arriving in the UK. Can you confirm the number of asylum applications in the year to March was 26,903. The number of asylum applications in the previous year was 35,230. That is a drop of 24%. compared to the previous year. So this is not the highest number of asylum applications that you have ever had.
Boats, Chair,
okay, that's not what you said. And we do need accurate information for the committee. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Chair. And if I can move on to the Nationality and Borders Bill, Home Secretary, because one reading of the new bill is that anyone who arrives here in the United Kingdom illegally from a safe country will be denied asylum or deported to that or another safe country. So can I ask, and I want a quick answer, how many return agreements do you actually have in place?
Well, just on returns agreements, there are a range of returns agreements that are already in place. I have signed removals agreements with India and Albania for very good reasons. When it comes to India, we have one of the highest numbers. They do make up the highest numbers of people in the United Kingdom with no legal basis to be here. And then with Albania, there are more foreign criminals from Albania in the UK than from anywhere else in the world.
So you've got 2 in place. How many return agreements do you have under negotiation at the moment so that people can be returned?
So we don't give a running commentary in terms of our return agreements, but we are in discussions with a whole range of countries around the world when it comes to returns agreements. And it's really important to recognise as well that we're in active discussions with EU member states on bilateral arrangements. I've spent a great deal of time, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany. Last night I was speaking to my French counterpart as well. There is a very, very significant recognition of a migrant crisis. Of course, the numbers are very high. As COVID measures and restrictions have been lifted across Europe, there are millions of people on the move. This isn't just an issue for the United Kingdom. This is an issue for European countries as well. We have formal pre-existing readmissions agreements with both Switzerland and Bulgaria and Romania, and we continue to process returns on those bases. So there is a significant amount of work taking place on returns agreements. And finally, just in relation to France, in discussions with my counterpart last night, there is a recognition actually with France that there is more that we need to do together to do much more collaboratively when it comes to returns. And my final point actually when it comes to returns and removals, our policy is one of removing people with no legal basis to be here, and that is part of our approach when it comes to charter flights and removing people through charter flights. So these are negotiated with countries on an ongoing basis.
Well, let's be clear here, because there's a lot of rhetoric there, but actually the way that you can implement this policy is determined by whether or not you have return agreements in place. So what proportion of asylum seekers do you anticipate returning to another safe country this year? What proportion?
Well, I can't give you that figure right now because there is a great deal of work that is already underway. When you look at the removals that we remove people on a weekly basis from the UK that have no legal right to be here, including asylum seekers, people that have had their asylum cases that have failed, they've exhausted all their appeals rights, they've gone through the courts several times, including FNOs. So we're constantly removing people. And on that basis, we have a range of scenarios to assess the possible impact of the bill, as you touched on, under the existing operating system that we have, which is charter flight removals, return agreements that we have in place with other countries, more return agreements that will come with future countries as well. But, you know, this is a constant, this isn't just a fixed matter of just saying we have X number of agreements and we expect X number of people to be removed. When it comes to removals, it is well known and it is well established that there are a number of barriers and hurdles that are in place to removing people. And some of those barriers and hurdles to removals, we're seeking to address those through the Nationality and Borders Bill.
Well, of course, again, there's a lot of rhetoric, but you will be judged on your actions. So what do you propose to do with the people you can't deport after a reasonable period of time, waiting for a country to accept them?
Well, this isn't just about waiting for a country to accept them. As always across government, we will absolutely strain every sinew to remove people. And I think it's quite interesting off the back of the second reading of the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is absolutely focused on removing people through not just returns agreements, but through charter flights and removal of people. We're not just speaking about failed asylum seekers, we're also speaking about individuals that have participated in criminality, foreign national offenders.
Look, I get all that, but what do you propose to do with the people you can't deport? That's what I'm asking. What are you going to do with them?
Well, this isn't a case of what are we going to do with them. We absolutely make sure that when it comes to...
if you can't deport them, you've got to do something, Home Secretary.
Well, we are. That's the point. We are, and the current challenges that we face have already been spelt out in the Nationality and Borders Bill. All the measures that thwart us, endless appeals, all sorts of issues that come in. We will continue. We will challenge appeals as well. And I think it's important to reflect, if I may, Mr. Gwynne. We had second reading of our bill last night, which is focused on removing people. And there is a substantial part of Parliament that voted against that bill, including your own party. Yeah. So we will continue to remove people from the United Kingdom that have no legal basis through our returns agreements, through readmissions agreements, through charter flights, which we are running on a weekly basis, where we are removing people with no legal basis to be in the United Kingdom. And we will continue to work on that basis while seeking to negotiate readmissions agreements.
With respect, Home Secretary, you haven't answered my questions, and you have had 11 years to do all of that as well. So how many additional people do you estimate the Home Office will need to accommodate as a result? You can't tell us what you're doing with the people you can't deport. So they will have to be accommodated. What assessment have you made of the numbers of people that you will need to accommodate as a result?
Well, I think, first of all, off the basis of the Nationality and Borders Bill, the numbers will go down in terms of people to accommodate. And I think, actually, we should go back to the first principles around what this bill will do. This is a comprehensive reform, the first reform in decades, if I may say, and I haven't had 11 years to look at this. And what I would say to my predecessors, now, if I may, to all my predecessors as well, they have worked very vigorously, actually, through agreements, having returns agreements, through charter flights, through deportations, much of which have been thwarted by appeals, last-minute appeals that I think all members of the committee are very familiar with, but also a lot of campaigning by parliamentarians as well that try to stop our removals flights and deportation flights. So we will continue, absolutely continue, but off the back of the reforms that we are looking to bring in, we want to create a deterrent. We cannot continue to support what we're seeing right now, effectively people trafficking, smugglers, criminal gangs, exploiting our asylum system to bring in economic migrants and people that, quite frankly, are circumventing our legal migration routes, coming to our country illegally. And this is difficult. There are difficult reforms here, but the bill has a set of comprehensive measures that look at the entire system from an end-to-end perspective, from illegal migration to clandestine entry, to migrants, economic migrants, masquerading as asylum seekers, to people smuggling, to prosecutions that we'll bring in place.
We get that. I was there when you introduced the second reading debate. I heard your speech at length.
You also voted against this
measure. We probably should...
But we've not had an answer, Chair. That's the point. I asked how many... what assessment has been made of the number of people that will need to be accommodated as a result of these changes? And all we've had is waffle.
Is there a number?
Well,
is there an estimated number?
On the basis that we have introduced a Nationality and Borders Bill,
sure.
Which the Honourable Gentleman, again, has completely
just apart from the policy debates, obviously, that can continue, just is there an estimated number anywhere for the number of additional accommodation places that you're going to need?
Well, I think it's important to say, in terms of estimated numbers and projections, we have worked through a number of scenarios to assess the range of possible impacts of the bill. So this is relating to the bill. under our existing operating system. So these are the variables that we deal with right now when it comes to numbers of people in accommodation, number of people, if I may, in terms of returns estimates, including failed asylum seekers and foreign national offenders. And we will be publishing, because obviously it's part of our impact assessment for the bill as well, we'll be publishing that shortly.
OK, so we don't have the number now. Tim Lawton.
Home Secretary, good morning. You'll be glad to hear that the majority of this committee voted in favour of the Nationality and Borders Bill last night and need to see those measures in place. However, can I come on to the thorny issue of channel crossings, which obviously part of the bill is intended to address. At the end of last year, you made an agreement with the French to give them, I think the figure was 31.4 million euros you reported, to help with the prevention of the cross-channel migrants coming in. That, we were told when you wrote to the committee in March, I think it was, that money was going to be used for the doubling of the number of gendarmes, a suite of technology measures to improve detection, improvements to security infrastructure and provision of accommodation centres. Since that time, we now have a record number of boats which have come across the channel, and the number of interceptions has actually fallen by the French. So last night you announced that we're going to give the French another 50 million, or 54 million, I think the figure was, to do the same thing. So isn't that throwing good money after bad?
Well, first of all, if I may, Mr. Lawton, in relation to France, we will always continue to work with the French authorities. This is a shared problem. Specifically to last year, and again, I think if we can just reflect upon pandemic and what that has meant in terms of migration, we've seen all sorts of changes and patterns in behaviour. Specifically last year, we did double the number of patrols around the beaches of France, and there's been a great deal of technology investment, surveillance and intelligence. That continues. The purpose of the new agreement, I think, again, we have to look at this in the context of what we are seeing. This is never a static situation. This is an evolving situation. The numbers of migrants attempting these crossings from France has increased considerably. And we are also seeing, I mean, the French Interior Minister and I were discussing this last night, over 60% of the inflow coming into France is actually coming from Belgium. And this is an increased trend and a pattern. Gerald Darmanin, the Interior Minister in France, and I speak frequently about the trends that we are seeing. And of course, our counterparts in France, the operational partners, as well as our operational partners in the UK, which involves our intelligence partners, as well as border force people, as well as the PAF, have seen a complete change in the modus operandi in terms of the crossings, the actual geography as to where the crossings are coming from. So originally we were seeing much more focus in Calais and on Calais. Now we are seeing widespread dispersal along the entire French coastline. And this has been the pattern for the majority of the year.
So Home Secretary, that's even more worrying, because all our focus has been on France, on giving money to the French and working with the French security forces. You're now saying that a large increase in people coming across the Channel is coming still from France, but via Belgium. So people in Belgium think it's easier to get across the Channel by coming into France, despite the fact we've given them 31.5 million euros last year, and you're now about to give them another 54 million pounds to do the same thing. Why will it be different this time? The French are not doing their part. We've taken evidence on this committee about interception of crafts when they're in the water. International maritime lawyers gave us evidence to say that the French authorities are entitled and within international maritime law to intercept boats in the water and return the passengers to French territory, or to allow border force to return the migrants to French territory if they're picked up in British territorial waters. Yesterday, we had a French military naval vessel escorting one of the boats into British territorial waters and then trying to hand over the occupants to a boat full of journalists. This is ridiculous, and it makes a mockery of it. So just giving the French more money to carry on doing what they're doing badly is not going to solve the problem. When are you going to get the French to admit they can intercept and get them to intercept? And that is the only thing that is going to cut off that supply of people coming to Calais thinking they can get across the Channel, when in fact they shouldn't be able to get across the Channel if the French did what they're entitled to do under international law. Rant over, isn't that correct?
Well, first of all, if I may, just on France, France are intercepting more white boats than they did this time last year. So I think, we have to reflect upon that. And that is because the numbers are so high. The numbers are going up. Now, I've mentioned Belgium, you've mentioned Belgium as well. There is a lot of work taking place both with the Belgian authorities and the authorities in the Netherlands as well, and Germany. So these countries are all pivotal to stopping the flows of illegal migration then coming into northern France and France. Now, you've specifically spoken about tactics at sea, and I have absolutely discussed this directly with my French counterpart, and I've made it abundantly clear, and this committee, this isn't new news to the committee, I've raised this previously, and Paul Lincoln will want to come in on this as well, is that we have absolutely been looking at what we can do at sea in terms of maritime tactics, all within the legal framework, absolutely within the legal framework of saving lives at sea and international maritime law. And the French are aware of that as well. They absolutely know exactly what the responsibilities are. We have made
but they're ignoring it. But do you accept that the French have the power under international maritime law to intercept boats in the water, in French territorial waters, and return them to French territory? You do accept that?
Under saving lives at sea.
So what has your French counterpart told you when you said...
They absolutely recognise that, and they would argue that they are doing their bit. But what they will not do, and I think there is an important point to differentiate here, in terms of tactics at sea, that's different to actually pushing boats back or, the saving life at sea. They have a different application. Paul has spent a lot of time, and his team has spent a lot of time, having those operational discussions with the French. They have a different interpretation of saving lives at sea in the way in which the SOLAS principle actually applies. And as I've said, we are looking at all aspects in terms of pushbacks and how we can absolutely...
OK, but Home Secretary, that is an excuse from the French. The French having a different interpretation is the French giving you an excuse for not doing what they are not only able to do under international law, but actually obliged to do under international law, because two crimes are being committed by the occupants of those boats. One is trying to enter the UK illegally, and secondly is paying money to organise crime, both of which provide grounds for those boats to be intercepted, the occupants apprehended in as safe a way as possible, and returned to France. You are getting fobbed off with excuses. Just to move on, how many of those people who have come in the last year to the UK and then applied for asylum, how many have been granted asylum, and what's the state of play of the rest?
Well, I think, first of all, if I can just bring Paul in, just on the operational aspect with France, because Paul actually spends a great deal of time talking to the French about specifically interceptions, and not only that, the stopping of migrants coming over. And so far this year, there have been over 7,500 interceptions from the French side. Last year, it was 2,600. So you can see the difference in numbers, and that is through joint working, and that is through cooperation. I come back to what I've said about boats at sea, and the tactics that we are still investigating these tactics right now. Paul can elaborate on that. In terms of individuals that have received asylum since last year that have come into the UK, of course, we are processing cases. And again, throughout the pandemic, our asylum process obviously has changed dramatically, and it is subject to a lengthy discussion as well, but we give support, statutory support, to everybody that has come to the UK seeking to claim asylum. And of course, many of those cases are complicated, and they'll be going right now.
Okay, but can you just give us the figures? Because when Dan Omani was here last, he gave us the numbers of people who'd come and were claiming asylum through this route. He said that 50% of them had been processed by that stage. 70%, I think, had found to have no claim because they'd gone through a safe country. And I think only 20% had been recognised as having a legitimate claim. Now, what are the comparable numbers now of those who've come across, this record number who've come across in the first 6.5 months of this year? What is their status? What's happening to them? How many of them have been deported?
Well, first of all, from the beginning of this year, anyone coming from a safe EU country, they are inadmissible to the asylum system. In terms of numbers, Matthew may be able to give you some numbers, but specifically, we can give you a breakdown. We can write you with a specific breakdown because it's different from the start of this year, since we've left the EU, to last year. And obviously, as I say, I've already outlined this to Mr. Gwynn in terms of returns. There are returns taking place every single week, but I think Mr.
How many?
Was specifically asking about the cohort of small boat entrants, and we will, I think, need to write to you, unless Matthew has those figures, we will need to write to you with those specific figures.
Have you not got a ballpark figure of how many people who have arrived in the UK on a boat across the Channel have been returned to wherever in the EU?
No, we would have to write to you with that specifically.
You don't have any ballpark idea of how many that is?
Well, not if you're asking over. Well, it depends first of all over which time period. But as I've said,
okay, since the 1st of January this year, how many people have been deported?
They're inadmissible, so we will have to write to you with the details on that.
Diane Abbott.
Are we not going to get Paul Lincoln to comment? I think.
Sorry, before I bring you in, Diane, Paul Lincoln, do you have those figures on the number that have been returned, number of people who've been returned?
Was going to talk about.
I don't have those figures, Chair. What I can tell you is that when you look at the number of interceptions which the French made last year, so by comparison, at the end of June, and that of course is the last full month that we're dealing with, last year the French made over 6,000. Sorry, last year they made over 2,100 interceptions, and by comparison, in this year they've made 6,000. So, despite the sort of troubling of numbers of people who have been attempting to come across, the French have also trebled the number of interceptions which they have made. So, I think that's what the Home Secretary is referring to in terms of the increased action by the French.
Thank you, Diane Abbott.
Thank you very much, Chair. The committee has seen the Home Secretary's letter to our Chair about some of the changes in the Windrush compensation scheme. I wanted to ask, we know research on the census has shown that about 20,000 people migrated from Commonwealth countries before the immigration laws changed in 1973. So that's a broad figure for the numbers of people that might have been affected by what's called the Windrush scandal. In 2019, the Home Office's planning assumption for the number of claims that you expected was around 11,500. You have now, from the terms of the letter you've sent us, you've now dropped your planning assumption to 4,000 to 6,000. Don't you think, Home Secretary, that you're letting the victims of the Windrush scandal down?
Well, good morning, Miss Abbott. I think, first of all, it's important when it comes to the Windrush compensation scheme. It's important to reflect upon the very significant changes that have been brought into the scheme, in particular since December, where I've overhauled the entire scheme. £34 million has now been offered or paid to victims. And I'm also announcing that there will be no formal end date to the scheme. And this is to ensure that anyone, absolutely anyone who was affected by the terrible injustices of Windrush receives the compensation that they deserve. And along with that, I am launching an enhanced package of support for bereaved family members, applying for compensation to help them obtain the legal documentation required to process their claims. So, Ms. Abbott, you will be fully versed on not just the history, but the complexity in terms of various immigration changes since 1971, 73, and through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and also the changes in legal documentation that has been required over previous decades and government to help process these claims. It is absolutely vital that we do everything, and I believe we are, through the continued efforts of our ambassadors, the Windrush Community Fund, our stakeholder groups. But with regards to planning assumptions, which you have referred to, we do have the Windrush Help Team, and the compensation scheme work is absolutely focused on ensuring that anyone affected are compensated for the impacts. And we are absolutely grappling right now with the fact that not everyone who applies for documentation will be entitled to the compensation. And therefore, we are doing all sorts of things in terms of the actual work that we have within the task force, the compensation scheme, our caseworkers, to make sure that we are putting in, I think, mainly the support that people who are making those initial contacts with us, either for documentation or to the scheme directly, that they are being supported and we can help them in the right kind of way.
But you'll be aware, Home Secretary, that I think 110,000 people have signed a petition to have the compensation scheme, not judging whether people are here legally or not, but the actual compensation scheme moved from the Home Office. Because one of the reasons why the numbers of people applying for compensation have been so low is that people do not trust the Home Office. Are you willing to consider moving the actual compensation scheme to an independent body?
Well, I think it's important to reflect upon the sums of money that have actually been paid out or offered to victims. £34 million is a very, very significant sum. And having overhauled this scheme and gone through so many different details of the scheme, looking back, learning lessons, and actually working with members of the community, I do not think that the structural reform of the scheme or moving it elsewhere will necessarily increase the number of applicants or claimants coming forward. And I do also think that it's very difficult to estimate the volumes of eligible claims that are likely to be received. I mean, that is a challenging task. And we have a great deal of work that's taking place and extensive outreach efforts, not just by the Home Office, but actually by members of the communities, our stakeholder groups. The overhaul of the scheme was based upon clear feedback, but also the insights of people from the Windrush community. And we will continue, we will absolutely continue. I mean, we don't want to have reduced planning assumptions. That in no way is diminishing our commitment to giving support and making sure that those that are eligible for compensation receive the maximum amount. We have to continue to strain every sinew. And I do want to give the committee every assurance that we are doing that. And I'll just give you my personal reflection on this. I do not think that a structural change, i.e. removing where the actual compensation scheme is housed in government, will necessarily lead to a change in the number of people coming forward, because it'll be the same mechanisms within government, the same groups and members of the community that will continue to do the outreach and the engagement. What I would just finally say is that let's not forget the pandemic has changed the way in which we've been able to get out and about to meet members of the community. Our teams have worked relentlessly, and I hosted and chaired the stakeholder group just 3 weeks ago. And on that basis alone, everybody is determined, and I use the word determined in a powerful way, because that passion and commitment is absolutely there to make sure that those who've been wronged receive justice, and importantly receive both financial support, and those that may not need financial support are also being helped and assisted in terms of obtaining legal documentation. If that's required to process claims, if it's not a claim, but making sure that they're getting the support that they need.
So you don't accept that people don't trust the Home Office on this matter?
Well, we're working with people across all communities to build trust and confidence. And our task force and our stakeholder groups are doing that. But what I would recognise, absolutely, that trust will not be rebuilt overnight. It will not be built overnight, and I've said that publicly before. I think Matthew has as well. We're very, very clear about that. But that's why we're working in an engaging way, I think, in every way possible to build links within the communities, to regain trust and support. As I've already said, I'm announcing that there will be no formal end date to the scheme. Not having a formal end date also means that hopefully throughout this time we will continue. Obviously, we're determined to work to support people. I've already spoken today. We're going to bring an enhanced package of support for bereaved family members applying for compensation. These measures are absolutely based upon building trust, giving people confidence about not just our determination, but also the way in which we are reaching out and giving support. I do just finally want to emphasise the pandemic has stopped us from having direct personal engagement. Much of it has been online. We do hope that we can do much more, obviously. The way the pandemic is right now, we will respond accordingly to the challenges of the pandemic. But we're determined, we're absolutely dedicated as a department to bring about change and to rebuild trust.
Thank you.
Could I just add one thing? I'm
sorry, Permanent Secretary, because we're tight for time, we want to get some other questions in. If there's time, I'll come back to you on it at the end, or you can follow up in writing. Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Home Secretary. Home Secretary, you've previously highlighted concerns to this committee about the effect that Facebook rolling out end-to-end encryption on its messenger service would have in terms of our loss of referrals of child sexual exploitation. The numbers quoted from the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children are absolutely staggering. You've also told us that you are working with Ofcom and with tech companies to look at potential solutions so that we don't lose this capability. Can you give us an update on that work, please?
Yes, well, first of all, and thank you for raising this. I mean, end-to-end encryption is clearly a great concern. We're seriously concerned with Facebook. There are many representations. There's a lot of work that's taking place, actually, not just on the policy side, but also on the technical side with Facebook. Because we have very clear concerns that it will prevent law enforcement from securing lawful authorised access to vital content that will enable them and enhance their investigations around public safety and child protection. But of course, when it comes to child exploitation and abuse, I mean, the numbers are shocking. They're absolutely appalling. That's not just in the UK, but worldwide. And therefore, it is absolutely right that we continue to use all the tools to identify CSEA content that are not commonly used on end-to-end encrypted channels. We do continue, there is a lot of work taking place with Ofcom to analyse different technical options that are available. That work is continuing, and those tools are very much based in terms of trying to identify known CSEA images on end-to-end encrypted channels. Some of those are under development, and we will obviously talk about those in the near future when we can in terms of what we expect. But also, I think it's important to say that the regulator will obviously expect companies to demonstrate that they have reasonable systems and processes in place, basically, to keep users safe. And also work with us when it comes to law enforcement. We want to see people being prosecuted, absolutely. There is no excuse for not going after the perpetrators of these most abhorrent and appalling crimes when it comes to CSEA children in particular. And Ofcom will continue to have a tough suite of enforcement powers to use going forward. And our work when it comes to the online harms bill, online safety bill, are absolutely built around those principles.
Thank you. And from the conversations you've had with Ofcom so far, do you believe those tools that they're developing are likely to be successful? Are you heading towards an agreement with tech companies? Because obviously, as you say, the online harms bill is coming down through Parliament now.
Well, first of all, I can't comment on sort of ongoing technical work, and some of this obviously is sensitive in relation to law enforcement as well. But I have absolute confidence in the work that Ofcom are undertaking. And alongside that, of course, I mean, the bill itself is going to be so significant in terms of putting down the regulatory markers that we need. Tech companies have a massive responsibility. They have a massive responsibility when it comes to the content they allow to be hosted on their platforms. And I appreciate we are speaking specifically right now about CSEA, which obviously is absolutely abhorrent and appalling. As I've said, I cannot speak strongly enough about what we must do to go after the perpetrators. tech companies have a moral obligation and a moral duty to work with everyone, with governments, with regulatory bodies and law enforcement bodies as well, when it comes to going after the people that are perpetrating these appalling crimes. But alongside that, there has to be a recognition, and I think there is a recognition actually amongst tech companies, when we think about the entire spectrum of the type of appalling content that ends up on their platforms. CSEA is obviously the context we're speaking about right now, but we've had lots of work undertaken over recent years around terrorist content on their platforms as well. The Christchurch Call for Action was a very, very specific example where tech firms, to their credit, came together to address terrorist content. But then when we speak about other harmful content on online platforms as well, it is a fact we have seen just the most appalling abuse, racism, for example, anti-Semitism, online hatred, trolling of individuals, female MPs, for example, as well, which is a frequent issue that comes up. Some of the most appalling content that, quite frankly, must not go unchallenged. It should be challenged at every single level. And
well, I agree with you that tech companies need to do a lot more to clean up what's on their platforms. You mentioned racism. Obviously, we had some appalling examples of racist abuse targeted at England's footballers a couple of weeks ago. Lots of racist abuse, lots of abuse, general abuse online anyway, obviously comes from accounts that are anonymous. What work has been done since those incidents a couple of weeks ago to locate and to prosecute the people who are responsible for this abuse?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's absolutely important to say that no one, absolutely no one, should have to endure racism. And the accounts of racism that we have seen has been absolutely appalling. And I've spoken very strongly about racism as someone myself that has experienced it, but in particular in relation to our footballers that have had to endure racism. That is completely unacceptable. And I think also what we saw last week, we just saw appalling levels of racism. It is absolutely vital that we all come together in a determined way to stamp out this abuse and work across every aspect of government and policy. But you've asked specifically about what work has taken place in relation to the incidences. The police have obviously been working to identify the perpetrators very publicly, actually. They've had public appeals around identifying perpetrators of abuse. And there's work that has taken place by the Home Office analysis team as well, that has also found that online, that found that a lot of the abuse that came, which was out there online, came from overseas. And that is online abuse. So there is much more work taking place on that. And that speaks to platform tech companies and the platforms that they have that is hosting this appalling abuse. But the final point just to make around football is when it comes to football, of course, we are going to change football banning orders. And that will also include obviously a change to the Act, and I think it is the 1989 Act, where we will absolutely now look to bring the online aspect into that Act so that anybody that is caught or perpetrating online racist abuse, the type of abuse that we have seen, will be subject to football banning orders going forward.
Thank you. Just one point I wanted to clarify. You said a lot of the abuse came from overseas. Is that from individual accounts then? Because I know the head of MI5 spoke last week and was very clear that this abuse was not sort of a coordinated bot campaign, for example, from an overseas nation state.
So what I would like to do, we will share with the committee the information that we have. We will do that confidentially because obviously some of this is very sensitive. We will absolutely do that in terms of the identification of the abuse that came from overseas and the analysis that we've undertaken in the Home Office. I think we should absolutely share that with the committee.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. Thank you, Home Secretary. Deanna Davison.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Home Secretary, for being with us today. I'm sorry for any background noise. My office looks down onto Parliament Street, and as you can imagine, every Wednesday before PMQs, it gets quite noisy. But it means I also sometimes get to witness some of the horrific incidents that occur at protests. And on Monday this week, I saw a number of police officers assaulted And that's why I was kind of really pleased to stand on a manifesto around the police covenant. And I understand there was a board meeting last week on the police covenant, and I just wondered what feedback you've had so far from frontline officers and from the Police Federation on that.
Well, thank you. And you've just spoken very clearly. You see day in, day out. What I can only describe, I mean, just the abhorrent and appalling abuse of people that quite frankly put their lives in danger to protect us every single day. We saw that last summer. We've seen this far too much. But you've specifically referred to the first board meeting that we held last week with our policing partners and staff associations across the policing family with regards to the police covenant. There are a range of issues. There are some challenges and there are some issues that have stemmed from a lot of the work that we're doing. And it's detailed work around the covenant. I'll be more than happy to come back and talk about this at length because there is a great deal of very positive and proactive work. First of all, absolutely, manifesto commitment for this government, we are going to deliver on the covenant, and rightly so. We are working with not just policing partners, but we are working with staff divisions because the covenant will apply to family members as well. So there's a very layered approach to the covenant. Number one, we are looking at a lot of good practice from around the world when it comes to the covenant, reaching out in terms of families, how we can support them, but also how we support our officers as well. And bearing in mind policing and the role of policing is constantly changing. The role is evolving when you look at the changing nature of crime and actually the changing nature of abuse and assaults on our police officers. It is absolutely vital that we ensure that we bring in some very clear measures to protect them. So, for example, we are going to be bringing in a chief medical officer for policing so that we can absolutely give our police officers the right kind of medical support, guidance and support for them within the NHS if they're subject to abuse, violent attacks, how they get their treatment. Occupational health is absolutely critical for our police officers. They see some of the most appalling things day in, day out. They turn up at scenes and incidences where, quite frankly, some appalling scars can be left upon them that can have a terrible psychological impact upon them as well. So giving them the occupational health support is vital. And alongside that, of course, is giving vital mental health support, which we are absolutely committed to doing. So across the 43 police forces, we want to see consistency and coherence around the support through the covenant. And the covenant is an important way in which an umbrella we can bring greater standards, transparency, but consistency to all our officers, because we cannot have a situation where it varies. And currently forces do brilliant work. I have to pay tribute to all our forces. They do different work and they have great schemes, by the way, great schemes based on a lot of guidance and frameworks that comes out of the National Chief Councils, Police Chief Councils. And of course, we are working to strengthen that. There are a couple of other areas that I would just like to touch on around the covenant. We are in the process of recruiting 20,000 more police officers. And of course, the profile of our officers that are coming into policing right now is also different to our existing police force. So they're much younger, they've got a different background, they're culturally diverse as well. They much more reflect the communities that they are serving in and that they're seeking to police. So we want to ensure that through the covenant, we're doing much more in terms of recognising cultural differences, diversities, giving families of different backgrounds much more support, because for many of them, this is the first time that a member of their family will be entering policing. And we want to retain them. So a lot of our covenant work, again, is about not just the recruitment, but the retention and how we can give people the support that they absolutely want. And much of this was also reflected in the public consultation work that we undertook around the police covenant.
Well, thank you for that. And it really is great to hear this government's kind of commitment to our police forces. But I just want to touch on a slightly different topic quickly, which is violence against women and girls. The consultation responses were vast, with so many people sharing their experiences. And just last week, I was followed home by someone on the walk home from work who did a sort of about turn on a bridge and was asking me all kinds of questions. So unfortunately, far too many young women have experienced this. So it's really reassuring to see the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy published today. And there was just one point in particular that I kind of wanted to touch upon, and that is the street safe scheme, whereby people can kind of register and pinpoint areas that they feel the most unsafe. And I'm just curious what kind of publicity that's going to have and how you're going to encourage as many people as possible to actually partake in that.
No, absolutely. And I think you've touched on some very, very sensitive but important issues to women and girls. And I mean, your own example, you know, being followed home is just, I mean, it's just not acceptable, right? And every day we have this, and I've seen this through the consultation, 180,000 responses. You know, I've worked with our teams here on the strategy. I've worked with third parties. I've worked with stakeholders. And I think it's just important just to reflect upon, this is harrowing, actually. Our strategy is absolutely built upon the experiences of people that have spoken. They've been brave. They've been absolutely brave in sharing their experiences. And I'm very open about this. We need people to be honest and to speak out about the appalling experiences that they have had. So the strategy has been published today. And you've asked some very specific questions, but the strategy, and I'm going to speak about how we're publicising much of this work, but the strategy is built upon some fundamental pillars. Number one, to prioritise prevention. We have to do this. We need to stop this from happening and doing everything that we possibly can on the preventative side. Supporting victims, that speaks for itself. There are too many victims and the trauma of victims is just harrowing. Pursuing perpetrators, we have to, I'm unapologetic about pursuing perpetrators. I'm pretty much, I think it's fair to say, not shy about being on the record about having a tough criminal justice system that actually goes after perpetrators and supports victims. And with that, though, it ensures that we, through this strategy, work with the police, education, local authorities, prisons and probations to be more effective. Now, on the prevention piece, which is exactly what you've spoken about, this is about safety of women at night, the work that we're doing, the hotspots in particular. We put in £3 million in a national communications campaign focused on raising awareness and ultimately trying to do much more around behavioural change. So giving women the confidence, absolutely. I believe that every woman should have the freedom to live their lives as we choose to. We should not be living in fear. That is a basic right for us all, whatever your age, whatever your background. And with that, this campaign is going to be crucial to doing that and focusing on public spaces, the hotspots, public spaces at night, making sure that we do much more on the Safer Streets Fund, but actually giving women and girls confidence to speak out so that where there are areas where they want to see more. For example, new online reporting platforms.
Apologies to interrupt you, Home Secretary. Apologies for interrupting you. Laura Farris also wants to ask questions about this same issue, and I'm conscious as well that we have a statement coming up later in Parliament today. So can I turn to Laura Farris and then you may be able to continue those points in response. Laura.
Good morning, Home Secretary. Yes, I did want to pick up on the subject of the strategy, and I know there's a statement later. On this committee, we have recently heard evidence from the London Victims Commissioner in the context of serious sexual violence. And one of the things that she told us is that sometimes gateway behaviour, and the example she gave actually was of stalking, was not treated sufficiently seriously by the police. Victims had reported stalking and it had been, I regret to say this, but sort of dismissed. And we've seen some evidence of similar gateway behaviour perhaps not being treated seriously in the Sarah Everard case. And so I wanted to ask you specifically what steps the Home Office is taking to ensure that the police response to what may seem like quite low-level offending is taken seriously and that the police are acting appropriately.
Absolutely. Well, look, I'd like to start by thanking you for your question because there's no excuse, quite frankly, whatsoever. And also our call for evidence to acknowledge, particularly in public places, that these gateway behaviours were all too common. And that, of course, leads to women and girls not feeling safe at all on our streets and across the country. So it is absolutely important. It is vital, absolutely, from a policing perspective, that they not only do more, and you've also mentioned the Sarah Everard case as well. This is exactly why I commissioned HMIC, FRRS to conduct an urgent inspection into the police's approach to tackling and preventing these crimes, which clearly affect women and girls. They disproportionately affect women and girls. And that also means now, from the work that we're taking, will take place through this strategy, we have to strengthen our system. And that means from our side at the Home Office, working to introduce a new national policing lead for tackling violence against women and girls. So this means a new top police officer, making sure that across policing we have consistency across police forces in terms of how they deal with these issues. When women and girls report these crimes and any examples of gateway behaviour, I shouldn't have to sit here and say they have to be treated seriously. They should automatically be given the serious treatment. And the individuals, women and girls, must be treated with respect in terms of the way in which these cases are looked at, how they're reviewed, how they're treated in terms of giving supportive evidence. And that is fundamentally a major change that we need to have in policing. So we're introducing a national police lead to address this and tackle violence against women and girls. This will drive forward a new approach in policing, but also a consistent approach across police forces. And this will also build upon the inspector's recommendations. There is a lot to do post the inspector's recommendations in terms of addressing violence against women and girls. And I just think there is just so much more to do in this space. And our commitment...
Could I pick up on one point, which I think is something I think that ripples beneath a lot of these issues. And it's primarily around girls, actually, and that is the accessibility of online porn, which many young kids, school kids, can access at the click of a button. And it seems to me that even if you have the best policing, the best teacher-focused approach, the best parental guidance in the home, you can't really change the guidance, the culture where you've got 13-year-old boys who are able to access not just ordinary porn, but really extreme, violent pornography, which affects their attitudes. And I'd be interested to know what the Home Office is doing about this.
Yeah, well, the Home Office agrees completely, absolutely, with the point that you have just made. And I do, as Home Secretary, my views on this are very, very strong. And this is why I absolutely believe, as part of the online abuse, the harms bill, there is more that we have to do here in terms of absolutely having age assessments, having those gateways to stop the access to what, quite frankly, is extreme pornography that leads to some of the most appalling behaviours, behaviours that should never, ever, ever be accepted or deemed to be acceptable. So this is exactly where the cross-government work is taking place with Department of Culture and Media and Sport in particular. I want to see those proof of age, measures come in. I think we need that. Obviously, as you've said, there's so much more work to do. This is about behaviour change. We have to absolutely make sure that education and the other aspects of government continue to work in that way. And, I'm doing everything. I strain every sinew. I'm very determined. I hold strong views. Naturally, I hold strong views about this. I want to make sure that we protect women and girls, but I want to make sure we protect the public and ensuring that the public come to no harm. And to do that, that means we have to work collaboratively across government to, challenge these companies as well that are hosting some of this disgusting material.
Thank you. And my final question, Chair. One of the themes I think that's been raised quite a lot is around public street harassment. And I read your article in The Times with interest this morning. And it seems to me that that is certainly something that is still, a door is being left open in that regard. And I've been working on it with some young women in my constituency and with Our Streets Now, the campaign group. It's true that it's already a public order offence, but it's been striking to me that lots of young women don't know that obscene sort of shouting and screaming in the street is a public order offence. And again, I've heard reports that when or if, it's probably if actually, they do go to the police to report it, again, it's often been brushed off, dismissed as a sort of unpleasant incident that's best forgotten rather than criminalised. Could you sort of talk us through your thinking and really where you are on the issue of a discrete offence for public street harassment?
Absolutely. No, this is very, very important. It really is. And also our call for evidence. absolutely acknowledge this about sexual harassment in public places. It's all too common. Yep. And I'm very familiar with our streets now, and actually the work that you and many other colleagues have been leading on. And I've spent time as well with campaigners. And it is extraordinary. You know, so first of all, our priority must be to ensure that women and girls know that they can report these crimes, but also have the confidence. I want them to have the confidence to do this, because alongside the comments that I've just made about changes in policing, we are bringing in changes in policing, and I'm unequivocal about that. These changes, part of the VOG strategy, are coming, and that means that the police will need to enforce the law properly and give women the confidence that if they report an issue, if they report these crimes, it will be dealt with. And women and girls will watch the police on this. I mean, I can't speak strongly enough about giving women and girls public confidence. That public confidence comes two ways. You know, to have public confidence in policing, the public need to know that the police are going to take any crime that is reported to them seriously. So I am looking very, very carefully where there may be gaps in existing laws about how a specific offence of public sexual harassment could address this. You'll appreciate as well, this is complex, but it is important. I want to make sure that we work with colleagues, we work with campaigners to ensure that anything we do in this space has the desired outcome. You know, we want to make sure that this is fixed, this is resolved. And quite frankly, right now, I do everything possible when it comes to the policing side, while supporting women and girls, victims, know that they can report these crimes and have confidence in the process in doing so.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then just finally to follow up, it would be very helpful. We look forward to the information, the confidential information about racist abuse online. That would be very welcome. We look forward to you writing to us with the information that Tim Lawton asked for on the number of people who've arrived since January or previous and their current status and how many have been returned. It would be helpful if you could also clarify before the end of the day the dates on which the Home Office received the interim and final reports from the HMIP and ICB on the Napier Barracks and when those will be published, and also confirm when the impact assessments for the Nationality and Borders Bill will be published, and also ensure that that contains estimates on the numbers requiring accommodation. And then one final question for me. I have been told that the Kent intake unit right now, the Home Office has 14 and 15-year-olds sleeping on camp beds and rolled up mattresses in offices who have been there for days, living in unsanitary conditions which are not COVID compliant and are running out of fresh clothes with no way to wash them. Obviously, they're supposed to be there for less than 24 hours. Can you tell me whether this is true?
Could I bring Matthew in on this? Because there have been steps and measures that have been put in place this week around the Kent intake unit.
Thank you, Home Secretary. Thank you, Chair. It is true that on occasions in recent days when there's been a large number of arrivals in one day, for instance, through the small boats route, that we have had a large number of children under 18 in that situation. It goes to the conversation that we were having earlier about the importance of working with local authorities, with more local authorities providing offers of support for those young people in their care, because that is ultimately where we need to be moving them to. But until they can be moved there, then obviously we need to hold them at the Kent intake unit and provide that safeguarding support ourselves.
So is it true that one of those young people, one of those under 16s, has been there for 10 days?
I don't think anyone's been there for as long as that, Chair, but if that is wrong, then obviously I will write to you straight away. I was there myself last week to see, and there were a number of children there in the sort of situation you described, but none for anything like 10 days. And since then, all of those who were there have been moved into different parts of the country. So
are there still under 16s sleeping on camp beds and roll-out mattresses in offices?
They're not offices, but there is a space which is absolutely not ideal, which is it's called the Kent intake unit. So as its name implies, is where people go if they are in that category at the very beginning of their journey. It is where we do the initial screening and so on. We have a lot of support from the Refugee Council, and we obviously have to. It's not ideal to hold them there, but it is obviously better to hold them there than to to not know where they're going until we can be sure that they're going into the care of a particular local authority. And we're extremely grateful for the cooperation that we do receive from some local authorities and would encourage others to step forward with offers.
So the backdrop is that the number of children and teenagers arriving as unaccompanied asylum seekers is a 42% lower in the year to March than the previous year. But you've been warned repeatedly by Kent County Council that Kent was having to respond to a much too high a proportion of those cases rather than them being spread around the country. Kent has also repeatedly told you that the National Transfer Scheme is not working. You've also been warned by HMIP in October and by the Children's Commissioner in February. The Children's Commissioner called on you to put in place contingency plans to prevent this kind of thing happening. Why did you not do so?
We do have in place a contingency plan, and that is what is happening at the moment. That is exactly the situation I described. What I'm saying is it's not nowhere near as good as having further offers of support from different councils, so that we can move those unaccompanied asylum-seeking children into the sort of places where they can get the care that they need.
So you have the power to require local authorities to do more, and you have the ability to fund local authorities to do more. Why have you not done so if you have children who may have taken some very traumatic journeys and may be highly vulnerable, spending days on end in cramped and unsuitable accommodation?
Well, the Home Secretary, working very closely with the Secretary of State for Education, has been engaging with local authorities on that very issue.
Home Secretary, why have you not required local authorities to do more, to do their bit to help Kent?
We are, actually. It's wrong to say we're not engaging or requiring local authorities to do more.
So you're making it mandatory?
No, well, we brought in changes to the National Transfer Scheme. We have to work with local authorities. I think this comes back to Diana Johnson's earlier point as well. We have to work with local authorities. And mandating, there have been plenty of calls to mandate, but we get a lot of pushback from local authorities as well. So we have to work with them. And that means putting more money in the system, which we have been doing on a regular basis through the National Transfer Scheme. And we are working across government, both with education, particularly on children, and social services, but also with MHCRG as well, the Department for Communities and Local Government, because these are our stakeholders, these are our partners. We cannot work on the principle of just imposing requirements of local authorities. And we need to absolutely continue to work with them. I mean, we do that, we absolutely do that. And it is difficult, and Matthew has just highlighted as well. We would absolutely be delighted to engage with many, many more local authorities. And there are many authorities around the country that quite frankly have written to us and said that they will not take asylum seekers or children and have been very, very firm in their resistance. So it's important that we continue to engage and work in a collaborative manner on this.
So if you've failed to get other councils to do more and you have real pressure now and you need better contingency plans, given that Wendy Williams said that you needed to see the face behind the case and provide greater compassion, do you think that holding under 16s in this kind of accommodation for days on end exemplifies compassion?
Well, I think, first of all, Wendy Williams' recommendations are very specific, obviously, to the department and to Windrush. But when it comes to children, asylum-seeking children, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, their welfare is absolutely our priority. And we cannot deliver that on our own. I think it's really important to emphasise that. As a government, we have statutory duties and responsibilities, which from a Home Office perspective, we will fulfil. But we can only do that in collaboration with others. So with regards to your point about contingency, absolutely. We are constantly reviewing, revising, looking at our contingency arrangements and work. There is a great deal of operational work and planning taking place right now. From the weekend, there's been a great deal of work that's been taking place. And I do also think that comes back and it speaks to the point about collaboration across the country, working with third-party stakeholders and local authorities, But the fundamental principle here, again, is this is exactly why we have to do much more to stop illegal migration to the United Kingdom. And it comes back to a lot of the work with the Borders and Nationality Bill, why we should absolutely make sure that we don't have small boats and channel crossings coming to the United Kingdom, because, Chair, as you are highlighting, this puts a lot of strain on our system, on local authorities, on parts of the country. And in terms of fulfilling our statutory duties, we are absolutely committed to doing that, but we can only do that in a cooperative and collaborative way with other parties.
Okay.
Can I just add, Chair, that the compassionate approach that I've seen Home Office colleagues provide in extremely difficult circumstances in recent days and weeks has been absolutely brilliant, and is a testament to that value, which, as you say, Wendy Williams has highlighted, and we are determined to carry on being an extremely compassionate department, and that is what they're demonstrating, and I'm very proud of it.
Well, it'd be very helpful if you could write to us on what action you are taking to improve the contingency planning, because if this is happening when you've had a 40% drop in under 18 unaccompanied asylum seekers, that obviously raises considerable concern about what happens in other situations. Could you also write to us about what the Home Office has done in response to the ICB, the Inspectorate's recommendations that were made on the enforcement on the in the Channel that we didn't have time to ask you about today, their report from last autumn, which raised concern about there being gaps in the criminal enforcement in the Channel, and also called for a further wider review of the criminal investigation and prosecution capabilities of the border force. It would be very helpful to have further information on that, and we welcome the further cooperation with France and hope that that will deliver further results. Thank you very much to Home Secretary, Permanent Secretary, and Paul Lincoln for your time this morning. We very much appreciate it and look forward to the further information that you're able to provide us. Thank you. Order.
Thank you, Chair.
Order.
Has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding.
Order, order. Welcome to this evidence session of the Home Affairs Select Committee. We're taking evidence this morning from the Home Secretary and the Permanent Secretary. Welcome to our witnesses. We also have Paul Lincoln from the Border Force with us this morning. Welcome to our witnesses. We're very grateful for your time this morning. Can I begin with a quick first question around the COVID border arrangements? Obviously, the Delta variant is now responsible for the highest COVID rates that we've ever seen, and it is clear that from the scientists' evidence that there were multiple introductions of the virus over several weeks that helped it spread so fast. So the system that you have in place to prevent new variants spreading clearly didn't operate quickly enough to prevent that happening. Why is that?
Well, Chair, good morning. Why don't I come in and just outline the system that we do have in terms of checks?
I think we probably don't have time to go into the factual things that everybody knows. What I'm keen to understand is, given that this system clearly failed, why did it? And therefore, what will we need to do to prevent future new variants?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to say the system has not failed. This is a comprehensive system across the whole of government. This isn't just Border Force and the Home Office. This is a system that has been put in place across government, working with the Department of Transport in particular, but also working with the JBC, who I understand have given evidence in private to the committee recently. And the fact of the matter is we do have an end-to-end comprehensive approach when it comes to border security, but importantly, health measures at the border, and that is through the 100% compliance, the checks that we have in place, and of course, as the country will be very well aware, with the red, amber, green traffic light system that is put in place. But I'm very happy to ask Paul to come on in to speak about the measures and how we are absolutely making sure, through the genomic sequencing that has taken place, we're able to spot variants of concern, and in addition to that, actually deal with them when it comes to the MQS process and through the red listing of countries, how that is managed across government.
But it clearly did fail, because we've got more cases in many areas of the country. We've got more cases of the Delta variant than we've ever had of any COVID variant at all. So it clearly failed. Now, there may be specific reasons, but it clearly failed. How can you possibly say that it didn't fail to stop the new variant spreading right across the country?
Well, what I'm saying, Chair, is that we have a comprehensive end-to-end system when it comes to managing health measures at the border, and the government has had a long-standing record and policy of managing health measures at the border, which is very, very well publicised and well aware. And on top of that, of course, we have the largest genomic sequencing capacity in the world, effectively, which has been able to spot these variants of concerns that have been coming into the country. And that has also helped to structure the way in which governments across the whole of government, I should emphasise, based on JBC, based on work with the Department of Health, based on work with the Department of Transport, then that measures are then operationalised at the border through Border Force, but also upstreamed in terms of checks that carriers are undertaking.
But it clearly hasn't worked. And the reason this matters is because, given that it hasn't worked, we need to have confidence in what you're doing for the future, whether you're going to react quickly enough to any other new variants that might somehow threaten the vaccine programme. And if you won't even recognise that the system did fail on Delta, it's very hard to have confidence in it. Just one final question on this. NervTag said on the 16th of April that it was worried about India and that travel advice needed to be reviewed. You'd already seen a big soaring of cases, doubling every week in early April in India, and concerns being raised about potential new variants. Given that NervTag said that on the 16th of April, why did it take a full week until the 23rd of April for India to be put on the red list?
Well, first of all, Chair, it is entirely wrong to suggest, that we delayed putting India on the red list. Which is effectively the suggestion that's being made. There were other countries that were put on the red list, including Bangladesh and Pakistan, early in April, and that decision was taken on the basis of the positivity rate of people entering the country and the data that showed the proportion of people testing positive. So this does come back to effective measures where we were able to test people who were coming into the country was 3 times higher amongst people coming in from Pakistan than India. And of course, the date of the India red listing, the ban was the 23rd of April, with everyone arriving from India then being put into quarantine in a hotel for 10 days. And that is also 5 days before the Delta variant was formally put under investigation on the 28th of April, and 2 weeks before it is labelled a variant of concern on the 7th of May. And even before India was red listed, everyone had to quarantine from red listed countries on arrival for 10 days, and also take a pre-departure test, take further tests on day 2, day 8, and that was in addition to the upstreaming of checks through carriers, and carriers were explicitly, there's a fine involved for carriers, which Transport have put in place, effectively, basically for carriers to help us and support with that 100% compliance checks that were undertaken. And it is important to recognise that it is the testing capability and the sequencing that has been able to identify variants of concern, and that is fundamental to government policy and will continue to be, as colleagues Matthew and Paul testify. And I would suggest, Chair, other colleagues across government would testify. You've spoken to JBC, if you speak to Department of Health and the capacity there, and Public Health England, these are all important component parts that come together to demonstrate the
we need to move on to another
that is taking place when it comes to the end-to-end border policy.
Unfortunately, Home Secretary, I don't think there's anybody in the country who thinks that your border policy worked to prevent the Delta variant spreading right across the country, and we can see the evidence. And so it's therefore quite troubling that you're effectively saying the policy did work and isn't being changed in order to react more swiftly. But we need to move on. Stuart MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. If I could start just with one quick question about the EU settlement scheme. I don't want to reopen a debate about how that scheme should have been designed or whatever else. It's specifically about an elderly person who has missed the deadline and needs medical treatment. And because they haven't applied in time, they're then charged, levied a charge for the treatment that they get. If that person goes on and applies late and the Home Office accepts that they had a reasonable excuse for that late application, that's well and good in terms of the status. But the problem, as I understand it, is that they would still have to pay that bill for their NHS treatment. When I asked the Minister about this when he was here at the committee last autumn, he said he would have found that outcome bizarre and that it wouldn't have made sense, essentially. Is that an accident that has ended up being the guidance? Why is that the case?
Well, I think, first of all, if I can just speak about the EU settlement scheme, applicants have had 27 months to submit their application. And I think one of the important points, there are several important points to make about the scheme itself, because it is a success, and the way the scheme has been designed, and the fact that more than 6 million applications have been received and more than 5.4 million have been included, demonstrates the effectiveness of the scheme. Now, of course, I will absolutely recognise that where there are specific cases, we will look at the circumstances around cases, and we have demonstrated great flexibility around all cases in the EU SS scheme. And not only that, when we look at the length of the scheme, how long it's been open for, the ways of working...
You're not answering the question. I don't want to reopen the whole debate about the EU settlement scheme. I simply want to know why it is that somebody who has a reasonable excuse for a late application would still have to pay thousands of pounds in NHS charges, despite the fact they did have a reasonable excuse. Perhaps this lady or gentleman has early onset dementia, for example. They didn't realise they had to apply. Surely that's something that Home Office will look again. That's all I'm asking.
Well, first of all, it's the Department of Health and Social Care has made it clear that where a late application to the scheme has been made, the individual will not be charged for NHS healthcare from the date of that application until the outcome is final. And this includes the outcome of any appeal and decision to refuse an application.
Yeah, no, that's good, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. But the point is that there will be people who will only realise they haven't applied when they go and seek treatment, and they will incur those charges anyway. For the NHS or the Department for Health and for the Home Office, you're talking tiny sums of money. But for these people, many thousands of pounds could be absolutely devastating for them. It's a tiny tweak. All I'm asking is that the Home Office and the Department for Health just think again about that.
Well, I think it's important to reflect, if I can just repeat what I've said, in terms of where there has been a late application, the individual will not be charged for NHS healthcare. And it is important to recognise that...
But they will if they incurred that charge before making the application. It's a tiny tweak that could make a huge difference to people. Otherwise, you're repeating the Windrush situation again.
I think it's wrong to conflate Windrush, actually, the scandal of Windrush, with this particular example that you are using. And I think that's very unfair. And it's also very unfair to the case...
Exactly what happened to Albert Thompson. Okay, if you're not willing to look at that again, a simple measure that would cost nothing to your department but would be absolutely disastrous for individuals.
Well,
just not even think about it.
Well, if you'd like to hear me answer the question rather than speaking over to me, it is also, when you're basically suggesting that I'm not prepared to look at this. The fact of the matter is that any claimant will be backdated if there is any example in the way in which you have outlined already. And it is perfectly true, as we all know, that when it comes to GP services, primary care, these aspects are all free of charge in the NHS, and rightly so. So if there is any example where someone has been charged, and obviously when that application comes in, then that individual will be supported and anything else will be backdated. So there are ways and there are processes in government where this is joined up across the NHS and across the Home Office. And as I've said, this is about how we actually treat individual applicants. And it's right that we spend the time to look at it.
I'll follow up and write you on the detail, but it sounds like there's a possibility. Well, you're trying to talk out time. It's quite obvious. I mean, if you're happy to look at it again, that's great. Can I ask you about Napier Barracks now? There was obviously the interim report by the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, and at the time nobody made a statement in Parliament about it because it was an interim report. Is it correct that the final report has been with you since May?
Well, I think, first of all, if I may, just in response to your last comment, it's not a case about talking out time at all. I think that's very unfair. You asked me to answer the question, that's effectively what I've been doing. And in terms of Napier, I would just like to start by actually saying, again, that in terms of we have taken all the appropriate measures and steps. And in terms of the report itself, the report will be published in due course, which is part of all the process.
Is it going to be published on Thursday by any chance? Am I correct in understanding it's been published on Thursday, despite having been with you since May?
Well, there is a date for publication.
Thursday, the last day of term.
Publication. Well, before Parliament rises, so there is a date for publication.
And you expect us to be grateful for that? I mean, this is classic Home Office, an absolutely scathing report that you've had since May, and you're going to punt it out on the last day of term with it. Are you going to make a statement about it or answer questions in the House?
If I may, I think that's incredibly unfair, because I think it's important to reflect and recognise that the Home Office absolutely takes all these reports seriously. It's right that we have time to go through them in the same way in terms of court judgments and findings that are also published, or reports that come to us. And I think it's an absolute disservice, particularly to Home Office officials,